Hello. Today I'm going to be talking about the Big Five personality theory and some criticisms of the Myers Briggs Type indicator. I thought it would be best to begin with the history of personality types and how our thinking has evolved over time. So, let's begin starting in ancient Greece, where the ideas of character and temperament developed and were thought to be caused by the so called bodily humors. Then came the Middle Ages, when religious interpretations viewed people as either divine creations possessed by good or evil. Following the Enlightenment in the 1800s, the search for basic traits of individual differences began and emphasized reason and rationality, while philosophers searched for the core of human nature. In the 1920s to the 1940s, Carl Jung and his colleagues searched for deep rooted individual differences in orientation towards the world. At the same time, statistics was becoming all the rage, especially for factor analysis, and were developed and applied by Raymond Cattell and other psychologists to assess intelligence and other individual differences. This type of testing based on statistics became the norm for college admissions, psychological screenings, and other applications. However, the 1960s to the 1970s brought a crisis in personality as traits failed to fully predict behavior across different situations. We should keep in mind that this was a time of great social change as Americans were opening new rules during the civil rights movement. And then following this, in the 1990s, is when the Big Five approach finally took hold, continuing to the 2000s as traits, motives, goals, and expressive styles were studied in more sophisticated ways and more attention was paid to the behavioral manifestation of traits. Finally, personality psychology was reestablished as a major subfield where there was more societal interest in predicting outcomes like work success and health. This then leads us back to Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who founded analytical psychology and helped launch the concept of trait approaches. He first started when he used the terms extroversion and introversion in one of his theories of personality. He described extroversion as an orientation towards things outside oneself and introversion as a tendency to turn inward and explore one's own feelings and experiences. And a person could have both introversion and extroversion, but only one would be dominant. Of course, I need to mention that there are more subclassifications, like the thinking feeling scale, that indicates whether a person is more logical and objective or more personal and subjective. There's also a sensation intuition scale that indicates whether a person is more prone to realism and imagination, and also a judgment perception scale, which indicates a person's orientation towards evaluating or perceiving things, and many, many more. Arguably, one of the most interesting things about these approaches is how they systematically classify individuals according to an understandable set of categories. But of course, further research has found that while Jung's introversion and extroversion theory of personality was valid, it was not the best approach to personalities because it lacks the other traits. So here comes the big five dimensions of personality, which were clearer and more helpful. The Big Five approach to personality is mostly research driven rather than theory based, and it is an inductive approach to personality, which means that the theory emerges from the data collected. One of the most remarkable but controversial developments in trait approach to personality has been trait aspects of personality. Factor analysis is possible because certain characteristics are associated, aka correlated with each other. For example, people who are outgoing also tend to talk more than average. They also tend to be more sociable. The statistical analysis, therefore, takes apart the scores on each characteristic and places them into a shared dimensional score. In this way, it reduces the observed characteristics into a smaller number of dimensions. So if someone scores a high score on a statistical dimension we label such as like extroversion, we know that this person is probably going to tend to be more outgoing, talkative, and sociable. Starting in the 1960s, a lot of research has converged on the idea that the most common trait approaches to personality can be captured by the big five dimensions. These five dimensions are called the Big Five, which are shown here. First up is openness. Open people generally appear as imaginative, witty, original, and artistic. People low on this dimension are thought to be shallow, plain, or simple, followed by conscientiousness. Conscientious people are genuinely cautious, dependable, persevering, organized, and responsible. And their opposite is impulsive. Impulsive people tend to be careless, disorderly, and undependable. Then we have extroversion, which we know from earlier. Extroverted people tend to be energetic, enthusiastic, dominant, sociable, and talkative. And that introverted people tend to be shy, retiring, submissive, and quiet. Next up, we have agreeableness. Agreeable people tend to be friendly, cooperative, trusting, and warm. But People low on this dimension are cold, quarrelsome, and unkind. Last but not least is neuroticism. Neurotic people tend to be nervous, high-strung, tense, volatile, moody, and worrying, while emotionally stable people are calm and content. Most famously today, there's something called the Myers Briggs Type indicator, which is based on Carl Jung's personality theory. The Myers Briggs Type indicator is weird for a personality assessment device for several reasons. For one, it is based on one of the classical statements of personality theory, and yet it claims to measure types rather than traits or other continuous variables. It is also widely used to explain a person's personality characteristics not only to their professionals, like their psychiatrist or therapist, but also to the person themselves. These distinctions have made the MBTI a popular personality instrument for organizational and industrial psychologists, and for people who simply wish to understand themselves better. It is approachable and sums up what could be daunting theories of personality into a consumable format. Personality psychologists, however, are generally not super optimistic about the MBTI. Psychologists Lawrence Stricker and John Ross conducted analysis that led them to a critical evaluation of both the typology of the assessment and the scales themselves. Their concerns have continued to be brought up by more recent criticism, as theorists complain that the Jungian concepts that are supposed to underline the MBTI have since been distorted. Psychometricians are troubled by the idea of psychological types and the limited evidence that the MBTI measures anything other than quasi-normally distributed personality traits. And according to a study entitled Reinterpreting the Myers Briggs Type Indicator from the Perspective of the Five-Factor Model of Personality by Robert McCrae and Paul Costa Jr., there was no support for the view that the MBTI measures truly dichotomous preferences or qualitatively distinct types. Instead, the instruments measure four relatively independent dimensions. The duo also found through their research that Jungian's theory is either incorrect or inadequately operationalized by the MBTI and cannot provide a sound basis for interpreting it. However, correlational analysis showed that the four MBTI indexes did measure aspects of four of the five major dimensions of normal personality, and that the five-factor model provides an alternative basis for interpreting MBTI findings within a broader, more commonly shared conceptual framework. More criticism involves the MBTI's type indicator approach that claims it can classify individuals into one of 16 qualitatively different types that are formed by a combination of four dichotomous preferences. The validity of this typology is the central question in the evaluation of the instrument, because in the absence of evidence for the typology, the assessment becomes a series of scales whose information is reduced instead of increased by dichotomous classifications, and the characteristics that set it apart from other personality assessments disappear. Another criticism is that the MBTI theory specifies three levels that have distinct typological characteristics and should be seen in qualitative differences between opposed preferences, such as E for extroverts versus I for introverts. Critics often point to the concerns of the validity of dichotomizing preference scores. They say that although trait psychologists often adopt languages such as types when discussing individuals, like when contrasting introverts and extroverts, it is generally done as a way to simplify saying above average or a normally distributed trait or below average. They also point to how Jung himself appeared to adopt this position in some of his writing, when he admitted that there are intermediate positions between true introversion and pure extroversion. The authors of the MBTI, however, adopted the interpretation that types are mutually exclusive between groups of people, and that the cutting point between them is not arbitrary, but a true point of zero. The last criticism I'd like to mention is that if we are to believe MBTI theory that there are 16 types represented by unique configurations and attitudes and preferences, then there should be evidence of these differences between types beyond the four preferences themselves. Most critics and researchers have interpreted this to mean that there must be theoretically meaningful and statistically significant interaction effects in addition to the main effects, and we have yet to find any evidence of this. Finally, I'd like to close with my opinion of the Myers Briggs Type indicator. While I do not have an extensive knowledge base to know the ins and outs of personality assessments, I do know it is what originally interested me in psychology. Sure, it is not often used professionally in actual studies, and is mostly used in day-to-day operations for corporations, between friends, and therapists here and there, but it also exposes people to psychology that otherwise would have never been interested. I now personally feel as though modern psychology has been hijacked and relabeled as a pop science from the media, and yes, the MBTI heavily contributes to this problem, but clearly something is working if it continues to get public attention. It has helped keep personality psychology in the spotlight despite so many psychologists not liking its assessments, and it lets us feel as though there's some easy way to describe something as complex as human personality. My discussion questions are there any theories of personality that can be used to create a foolproof or nearly perfect assessment of human personality? And if so, why or why not? Followed by, if we have wondered about personality for so long, why is there no correct theory? And then last but not least is, what is it about personality psychology that attracts so many people that otherwise wouldn't be interested? And finally, my sources. While this is not an exhaustive list, I did try to cite every source I could remember. Thank you for watching my presentation.